most people who have introduced breakthrough innovations have had people tell them that their idea was stupid, that it won't work, that it's impossible or wrong, or maybe that it's just immoral or that it shouldn't be done. And they've had to be able to endure that and disregard it to some extent. And I think that's why these people, the people who are extreme serial breakthrough innovators, start to have a resemblance to each other, because what you see are people who are unconventional. Sometimes they're a bit separate or disconnected from others. They've decided not to listen to social norms. They may not care what you think of them. They may do things that you don't understand. And it's all part and parcel of being able to stand up to the fact that other people don't believe in your idea, but you have to believe in it and you have to fight for it, even if it pisses other people off.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Tony Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the 20th episode of Business for Good, the final episode of Season 1. We're so grateful for those of you who have been listening and giving us feedback, knowing that this show enriches your life and hopefully your passion to make the world a better place via business is why we do this.
One of those listeners to whom we are grateful and want to give a shout out to in this episode is listener Alex Paul. Alex is a great guy who has been a listener devoted every single episode and has given us feedback after every episode, which is really helpful. He has implored us to ensure that there is a season 2. And so don't worry, Alex, you need not worry. There indeed will be. And Alex wants to start his own company. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't want to steal his thunder, but rest assured, it's a really cool idea that would make the world a much better place. So Alex, this is a public challenge to you to make sure that you are a guest on season 2 when your company is up and running, and we'll get to hear all about the cool things that you're doing.
Thank you, Alex. We love you and can't wait to feature you on the show when you're ready.
Now on to this episode. When I read NYU Business School professor Melissa Schilling's book in 2018 called Quirky, I immediately knew this was going to be one of those rare books I'd want to reread at some later point, which is indeed what ended up happening and what led to this episode. I read Professor Schilling's book when it came out and then revisited it just in the past few weeks since I found it so useful. And soon in this interview, you'll see why.
Normally, we profile businesses that are doing good in the world on this podcast, but today we're profiling an author who herself dedicated an entire book to those innovators and entrepreneurs who've tried to improve humanity's lot through their creativity.
Schilling's book explores common traits among some of the most successful innovators of all time. The litmus test for Schilling to enter such a coveted club is much higher than merely hitting the innovation jackpot and changing the world just one time. For Schilling, being a super innovator means being serially successful in a variety of fields. Think Einstein, Franklin, Edison, Tesla, Jobs, Kahneman, Musk, and perhaps most impressively to me, as you'll see in this interview, Marie Curie.
What we learned from Schilling's book is that while there's no formula for entrepreneurial genius, there are many common traits which seem to help. With great detail and fascinating stories of their lives, Schilling summarizes, quote, nearly all of the innovators exhibited very high levels of social detachment that enabled them to break with norms and almost maniacal faith in their ability to overcome obstacles, a passionate idealism that pushed them to work with intensity, even in the face of criticism or failure, and more.
Needless to say, these are exactly the type of lessons everyone can use, whether a first-time entrepreneur or a seasoned business veteran. So we brought Professor Schilling on the show and hope you enjoy hearing her insights.
But before we air our interview, I wanted to share some news with you, our dear listeners. I've loved doing this show for the past 20 episodes. I've learned an enormous amount and have been inspired by the work of so many of our guests. Paul and I have a friend, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, who reminds us that in both good times and bad times, never forget that nothing lasts forever. And it's with sadness that I say that my time as a co-host isn't lasting forever, but the show will go on. I have been extremely busy and I have a year-long book tour ahead of me, so I so sadly have to step down. But I still reserve the right to come on every once in a while when the time is right.
Well, you are always welcome back on the show as a co-host, and as sad as it is to see you exit, Tony, as the regular co-host, you, our listeners, will be pleased to know that we're already working diligently on season 2. We have some fantastic guests lined up for you, so stay tuned when that launches in about a month from now.
But for now, please enjoy episode 20 with the great business professor, Melissa Schilling.
All right, Professor Melissa Schilling, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. All right, let's talk about your book, Quirky. Why did you decide to study serial inventors and write about their lives?
You know, it's a funny story in a way. I've been an innovation professor for a very long time, and I've written an innovation textbook, and I thought I understood innovation pretty well. And then one day in class in about 2010, a student came up to me and said, what's going to happen at Apple if Steve Jobs dies? Because around that time, Steve Jobs wasn't looking that good. And I was sort of stunned by the question. And it wasn't the last time that I got a question like that about Steve Jobs. And I started thinking about it a lot because really, with all the research we've done, we've really focused on organizations and teams and maybe creativity processes, but we've never really looked that hard at innovation outliers, leaders who are thought to be particularly innovative. And, still in my mind, there was also the question of how much of Apple's innovation had been due to Jobs and how much of that was a myth. And how much of it was now embedded in the routines at Apple, and how much of it could be passed down to someone or learned by someone. And I became kind of obsessed with that question. And I had a year's sabbatical coming up, and I decided to just study Steve Jobs. So I spent, a really long time studying Steve Jobs. And the wonderful thing about that is that there's a lot of material on him, like videos and recorded interviews and books. And so it was really quite fun. And you could have a very immersive experience if you decide that you just want to get to know Steve Jobs. But the weird thing that happened was that I started to notice some uncanny similarities between Steve Jobs and another innovator I'd written a case about several years prior, which is Dean Kamen. And Dean Kamen is also a very unusual person who created the first portable drug infusion pump, the first portable dialysis machine, several extremely advanced prosthetic arms, the first wheelchair that could climb stairs, and then ultimately the Segway personal transporter. So a really prolific innovator, but with no medical background, never got a college degree. It's not even clear he graduated from high school. And he had a lot of strange and interesting personality traits that were very similar to Steve Jobs. And so then I got inspired and I thought, I'm going to put together a multiple case study research project. And I'm going to set up a protocol that selects a whole group of these people, which is tricky because they're rare people. And I'm going to study them and I'm going to see if the others have these things in common too. And if we can map these things up to the science on creativity and innovation and see if we can make sense of it.
I remember reading in your book, Quirky, Melissa, about Dean Kamen, and I knew he had invented the Segway. I didn't know about all of the other inventions he had. It was so impressive. But one of my favorite quotes from him in the book was you mentioned that somebody had told him that something he was trying to do is impossible, and Kamen responded, "Don't tell me it's impossible. Just tell me that you can't do it." And I thought, wow, imagine working with that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something a lot of the innovators have in common, was that they were not daunted by what other people thought were impossible, because they grew up with a sense that the rules didn't apply to them, and they were used to achieving things in their life that other people thought were impossible. So they very frequently just disregarded when other people said something was impossible.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Nelson Mandela's quote when he said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And how many times of things that you thought were impossible that actually came to fruition?
That's right.
Melissa, you write about how a lot of inventors are like one-hit wonders, but the people you study in the book, these are serial inventors, people like Kamen who had great successes in a whole wide variety of fields too.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Is that many of the people who've created great inventions stopped there?
Let me explain. First of all, the reason I chose to look at serial innovators is that when you have someone who's a one-hit wonder, it's very hard to disentangle the context or luck or something like that from the person. So a lot of inventions, a lot of famous innovations or inventions come about because it's the right place and time, or a happenstance opportunity or a great confluence of resources. And those are not people who are going to innovate over and over again. They just happen to be at the right place and right time, and they pick up the ball and run with it, and it's great. But then there are people like these people for whom it's their life's blood, it's their drive. They'll do it even if you don't pay them. They're so obsessed and motivated. They're often working towards a cause they see as bigger than themselves, and it's the only thing they like to do. I mean, Marie Curie is a super great example. She lived a really kind of a very unusual life for a woman because, first of all, at the time she was working, for people who don't know Marie Curie, discovered radium, polonium, radioactivity as an atomic principle, most of our ways of isolating radioactive isotopes. She also invented the first portable X-ray units that she drove out to the field during World War I and is personally attributed with saving over 1 million lives. So an extremely prolific and profound innovator. But she was doing this all at a time when women were not welcome in science. She was, one of very few women in science, and she was actively disparaged and discriminated against. And when she described why she did it, in part it was because she had this idealistic goal of helping Poland, because at the time Poland was oppressed by Russia and they were trying to basically eliminate it as a culture, but also because she just loved it, right? She would put her head down at the bench and start working, and she often fainted there because she forgot to eat or she forgot to sleep. And she ended up giving her 2 daughters to her father-in-law to raise. And, her daughter subsequently wrote a biography of her mother after Marie Curie died. And in this book, you hear the worship and the love and the adoration, but you also hear the sadness and the longing and the pining of a little girl who didn't get enough of her mother. And what you basically learn through this biography is that, Marie didn't feel like she could be a full-time mother. She couldn't be a mother. She needed to focus on science full-time. And so she let her father-in-law raise the girls. And her kids, they rationalized that. They said, Eve Curie ends up saying in all times, women who've wanted to be great artists or, great scientists have had to disdain the norm, which is love and motherhood. But Marie ended up writing a letter to Eve saying, it's not necessary for you to live such an anti-natural existence such as mine. I lived this life because I loved science. And what she was basically saying was she loved only science. It's just what she loved to do. And you can see that in Edison. You can see the obsession of Jobs in wanting to create. You can see the obsession in Elon in wanting to get us to Mars and to create cars that can run on renewable fuels. It's what drives them. It's not even a choice in a way.
When you were reading that book, did you feel sad for her daughter and for Marie?
I felt sad for both of them. I mean, getting to know Marie Curie really well was a very was a painful thing in a way, because on the one hand, she's incredibly inspiring and she's doggedly persistent and strong. And she just, when people would attack her, she wouldn't fight back outwardly in the press or by being obnoxious the way Jobs or someone would. She just put her head down and became determined and just kept at her work and would prove other people wrong. And, many people thought she was a very disagreeable woman. And my next book is now going to be about in praise of disagreeable women, because I think one of the reasons why women haven't held the leadership positions that they have is because we've maybe not been as disagreeable as we need to. But back to your original question. Yeah, it's hard. She lived a very difficult, lonely life, especially after Pierre died, because, Pierre Curie was really her soulmate, and he was very much like her, also wanted to live an anti-natural existence. And she became this really, really lonely woman who had a very difficult life.
Melissa, first, I can't wait to read your next book. Second, with regard to Quirky, the Marie Curie chapter was definitely, I found most riveting. I liked it all, but that was a particularly riveting chapter, especially since I knew embarrassingly little about her. But with regard to her daughter, I thought it was pretty stunning that, first, not only was Curie the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, she also became, the next time a woman won the Nobel Prize was Marie Curie, but the third time a woman won the Nobel Prize was her daughter.
That's right.
And
the other daughter, Irene.
Okay. So not Eve. Okay. Interesting. I wonder if she had a different view of her relationship with her mother than Eve did.
Yeah, I think she got to work more closely with her mother than Eve did.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that the Curie family now has something like 5 Nobel Prizes to their name. Wow. So it must be it must be like the most Nobel prized family in all of history, probably.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Many of the most successful innovators have dealt with real adversity. You mentioned in the book about Benjamin Franklin saying, and I'm quoting you, he once had to endure a brutal attack by a prosecutor while facing a jeering crowd of England's elite. However, Franklin remained stoic and silent during the proceedings and never shrank from the public life because his belief that he was pursuing his duty to serve God and mankind gave him a moral high ground that helped him make him resilient to such attacks. Tell us more how much the capacity to endure and overcome adversity is related to entrepreneurial success.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. So first of all, breakthrough ideas are by nature they disruptive and they seem unreasonable. So a lot of times students have come to me, for example, and said, "What do you think of my idea?" And I have learned over time, sometimes the hard way, to never judge their idea. All I do is try to give them the tools and resources they need to execute their idea and to refine it and to craft it and to pitch it. But it's very difficult when an innovator has a creative idea that's unusual. It's very unlikely that other people will see it and understand it and embrace it right away because they didn't have that unusual perspective, which is what made the idea breakthrough in the first place. Like it's by definition. So for people to bring these ideas to light, they have to, first of all, be able to endure the fact that other people don't buy into it. So most people who've introduced breakthrough innovations have had people tell them that their idea was stupid, that it won't work, that it's impossible or wrong, or maybe that it's just immoral or that it shouldn't be done. And they've had to be able to endure that and disregard it to some extent. And I think that's why these people, the people who are extreme serial breakthrough innovators, start to have a resemblance to each other, because what you see are people who are unconventional. Sometimes they're a bit separate or disconnected from others. They've decided not to listen to social norms. They may not care what you think of them. They may do things that you don't understand. And it's all part and parcel of being able to stand up to the fact that other people don't believe in your idea, but you have to believe in it and you have to fight for it, even if it pisses other people off.
And not to make the whole show about Marie Curie, but I do want to bring it back because it certainly wasn't only Franklin who was publicly excoriated. You have a really fascinating story about what happened with Marie Curie, and not that people were necessarily resistant to her ideas, though that may be, but to her personal conduct. And so I'm wondering if you can just share that story about, well, you know what it's about, but just to prime it for the audience, just share the story about the second time that she won the Nobel Prize and what happened with the Nobel Committee and the actual reception of her prize.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually steal some time and give you a second story related to that. But the first, what you're referring to, I think, is when after Pierre died for several years, Marie just kind of holed up in a darkened room, and she did her work, but she didn't really interact with people at all. And then slowly but surely, she sort of came out of her shell and she fell in love with one of her coworkers, another scholar named Paul Langevin. And he was married, she was not. And it ended up, the wife of Paul Langevin found a bunch of their letters and brought them to the press basically the day before Marie Curie was to be awarded her second Nobel Prize. Or no, actually, it must have been a little bit before. That must have been a couple of weeks before, because the Nobel Prize committee wrote her and said, "We don't want you to come. With this scandal, we don't think you should be here. We don't want you to come collect your prize."
So they weren't saying you can't have the prize. They just said it's too embarrassing for you to come be here with us, so don't come get it, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. Mm-hmm. And she wrote back and she said, "I don't think people associate I'm not quoting her word for word, but that she basically said, I don't think my personal life has much to do with my scientific contribution, and I'm going to come get my prize."
Wow. And she was faced by an angry mob at her house when they learned about this affair, right?
Yeah, and they threw rocks at her windows. And there was even a point in time when people were publishing articles about her in the press, and they were actually, it was strange. One of them called her a Jew. She wasn't actually Jewish, but they were using anti-Semitism to rouse hate towards her. Mm-hmm. There was actually another time.
Do you think the animus toward her was because she was a successful female scientist, or because of the social norms of the time that this affair that she was having really caused that much outrage?
Yeah, I mean, they're both part of the same thing, that women weren't to dare venture out of their roles. Because it's interesting to note that Paul Langevin didn't get much criticism at all. He wasn't hassled at all. And he was the one who was married. But it was normal for a man to have an affair. and it was not okay for her to have an affair or to be with a man who was married. But other scientists discriminated against her too. Like at one point, Lord Kelvin actually wrote to a popular press newspaper and said, her ideas are all wrong. Radium doesn't actually exist. It's just some compound of helium. And her calculation of the age of the Earth is wrong. And it was very unusual for a famous scientist to go to the press. That was a really strange attacking move. And Marie Curie didn't respond via the press. She just put her head down for 3 years, did calculations, and proved that Kelvin was wrong.
Now that's hardcore. I love that response.
It was tough.
Yeah. So, Melissa, let's just move along here to other aspects. So, you've talked about how many of the things that these serial inventors, have in common. So, for example, that they oftentimes believe things are possible that others think aren't possible, that they can withstand withering criticism and keep moving forward. One of the other aspects that you write about, though, and you've briefly alluded to it here, is that many of them really liked solitude. They really liked to be far away from other people. Maybe they even were quite socially abnormal. You quote Einstein, in fact, as lamenting how strange it was for him to be known so universally and yet to be so lonely. Or you even talk about Tesla, the man, not the car. For many people, there was a person named Nikola Tesla. And he wrote movingly about how he believed there was this pigeon who was his soulmate. So there seems to be clearly a correlation here between their success and their removal from much human social contact. But do you think it's a causal correlation? Like, do you think that they were successful because they were so socially abnormal or isolated?
I think in part, but it's also a complex relationship because, first of all, part of why they were alone was because they didn't cooperate with social norms, or sometimes they weren't capable, or they were just weird people, or in the case of Edison, he was largely deaf. So part of it was the obsession and the compulsion, and Tesla was overly sensitive to stimuli, so he didn't like to be around lights or loud noises. So part of what made them weird made them not social, and part of what made them weird facilitated innovation, and part of not being social enabled them to do unusual things. Because if you are socially removed, you can, first of all, you're much more likely to explore ideas sort of uncontaminated by other people's paradigms, right? You're less influenced by what the norms are. You might not be exposed to those norms, or even if you are exposed to them, you might not bow to them. So social isolation in some ways is valuable. Now that scares people a little bit because they think, oh, that means in order to be innovative, I have to lock myself in a room. And I don't think that's actually true, because I think you can get to the same outcome without social isolation, but it requires a willingness to be weird, or to be, it requires a tolerance also of other people. I think that if we cultivated more tolerance for weirdness and we didn't have such strong norms for consensus, that we would see more innovators bloom. One of the things that we're doing right now, for example, at organizations, is we have this really strong emphasis on teamwork and collaboration and group brainstorming and all these things, and getting along. And that all sounds great, and it probably feels really good, and it can make things run smoothly. But it's going to dampen breakthrough innovation, because for breakthrough innovation, you need people to stand up for weird ideas. And sometimes that means they're going to disagree with everybody else. And that's important.
Speaking of group brainstorming, tell us what you think this means for teams at companies who are asked to brainstorm. I know you think group brainstorming is bad for creativity. Why is that? And what are your recommendations for a better way?
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, there's a lot of research showing that brainstorming in teams is bad for creativity. Like, there's a bunch of psychology studies showing that when you brainstorm in teams, you get fewer ideas, you get less novel ideas, you get ideas of lower quality. And yet this myth persists that we will be more creative in groups, because I think the expression I've heard is that ideas can have sex and form new ideas. But what they're missing there is that when those two ideas have sex and form a new idea, it's kind of half of one and half of the other. So it ends up being more in the middle. And sorry, it's a little bit of a joke there. But basically, if you really want to have good brainstorming, you want to maximize your brainstorming output and novelty, you want to separate people. You want them to work alone first, and you want to encourage them to come up with their wildest, weirdest stuff. And you don't want to signal them in any way that they need to get buy-in or consensus on this. People should be encouraged to really explore the corners of their thoughts and their ideas and commit to those ideas and elaborate them before they ever share them with anyone. And they have to feel that when they do share them, that they're going to be welcomed and they're not going to be ridiculed or judged. Because otherwise, if you put people in a room together and you say, okay, work together and come up with an idea, those words, come up with an idea, already signals everybody you need consensus. If you need consensus, you're already factoring in what you think the other people believe and think. So you're going to present only your most acceptable ideas that you think already have some degree of buy-in or are most likely to have buy-in, which means you're going to get your most mediocre ideas.
And so when you say people should brainstorm by themselves first and then come to the group, I think you also say in the book that they ought to write down their ideas before sharing them, so they're really committed. So it's not like they're being influenced. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I've noticed that in group brainstorming, and I think you mentioned 3 reasons why it is ineffective. That one, you get the free riders who don't say anything. Then you get other people who may self-censor because they're afraid of being judged. And then there's also this tendency to come to a consensus quickly, that people want to go along and get along with their coworkers. And so they are agreeable with one another and they reach a conclusion, which is pretty fascinating to think about, given how ubiquitous group brainstorming is in work environments, I think.
There's also production, and there's also one more. There's production blocking, which means, and we're doing it right now. It means when I'm talking, you're not talking, and you're not even thinking about the things you would be thinking about if I wasn't talking. So, I'm hijacking your brain right now, just like you're hijacking my brain when you say something.
Interesting. Well, I think when I'm talking, a lot of people are thinking that they wish that I wasn't talking. So. All right, so that's one more recommendation in terms of trying to bring out creativity in innovators here. Let's also just talk about one other, which is probably most relevant for the show. In fact, is that it seems like nearly all the innovators that you studied were motivated by far more than just a desire for money. They aspired to a higher purpose. For example, you quote Steve Jobs as remarking that being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night saying we've done something wonderful, that's what matters to me. So there's this trend now toward conscious capitalism, where lots of companies are getting started, or even big companies are shifting to trying to have a more socially responsible, and I shouldn't even say socially responsible, more of a higher mission than merely making profits. And so I'm wondering what it is about these folks who you studied that indicated that they were interested in more than just money, and how important you think that is to increasing your chance for success.
Yeah. Okay. So I have to say that this was a big surprise to me, because there's nothing in the innovation research that would have suggested that idealism and innovation went together. Like, nobody's actually looked at it before. And intriguingly, we don't even look at idealism as a personality trait very often in management generally. And yet when I studied these people, most of them were just keenly idealistic. You couldn't help but notice it, right? You were going to see it whether you looked for it or not. And I found that really fascinating, but it was really clear why it worked. So first of all, we know that creativity is facilitated by intrinsic motivation. In other words, if you pay people for creative ideas, it actually makes them less creative over time. It's when people are working on something they find intrinsically interesting or important that they are most creative. So idealism provides this powerful intrinsic motivation because you feel like you're working on something that you really believe in. And because it's more important than money or reputation or sometimes comfort or health, or in the case of these innovators, sometimes even their families, they'll sacrifice a lot to get there. And it's part of why they were willing to be criticized, and they were willing to fail, or they were willing to put all their own money in, right? And the reason why they didn't give up, even when everybody else told them it wasn't going to work, is that it's because they thought they were working for something bigger and more important than whether or not you liked them or whether or not they reaped the rewards of being successful. And so the other thing that does, I'm going to say 2 more things real quick. It made them resilient, right? It made them tougher and more resilient to criticism. It also sometimes helps rally people to your cause. And you can see that with Elon Musk a lot, because he gets a lot of criticism in the financial community. And yet, if you follow him online, you'll see that he has this enormous fan base of people who believe in his mission, right? So and it's because of the cause. It's not because of the profitability of the company or his management skills. It's because of the cause.
Yeah, I remember one of the stories in the book where somebody had complained. I think that you were actually quoting from the biography of Elon Musk, but somebody had complained that they needed to work less in order to see their family more. And Elon Musk's response was, well, you'll be able to see your family more when we go bankrupt. And I just thought, that's the type of tenacity and perseverance and maybe lack of regard for social norms that, a lot of his fans celebrate in him for sure. And in fact, I mean, there's lots of the folks he studied that seem to have that. Steve Jobs felt like the same. I think a lot of people who worked for him felt similarly to that type of a story. But which brings me, I guess, also to the fact that perseverance is yet another one of the criteria that you are talking about that is common to all of these serial inventors, that they felt called by some higher calling to actually improve the world in some way, whether it's Musk trying to, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels or ensure we have a planet B, or maybe like a planet Mars, I should say, in order to get to, should we have to, or other folks who wanted to invent things that would really help people, like Dean Kamen's or Marie Curie's inventions. But it seems like perseverance is among the single most important character traits that these folks all had in common when I read your book.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I love that. You remember that? I don't know if you remember, there was a story in the book about Dean Kamen. And one of the things Dean Kamen invented that a lot of people don't know about is called the slingshot water purifier. And this is a device, first of all, that runs on a Stirling engine, which can burn anything and turn it into energy. So you could put dung into it or something. And then the slingshot water purifier can turn anything even slightly wet into clean drinking water. So he demonstrates it at conferences by urinating into it and then drinking the water that comes out.
Sounds great.
Yum. Yeah, delicious. But he thought that corporations would be lined up to sponsor this because it was, going to be such an incredible innovation for developing world. And then he was, to his surprise, they weren't lined up. And that's because the countries that have clean drinking water problems are the countries where there's not a lot of money to spend on them. And so corporations weren't, for-profit corporations weren't interested. So he turned around and he put 50 million of his own into it. And people said, Dean, that's a lot of money. Your company's pretty small. Are you sure you want to do that? And he just said, hey, look, the world is a mess. What if we can do something about it? And that's that. When something is important to you, when something was important to him, it was way more important than money. And he was going to find a way to persist, even if other people didn't finance him. Actually, you see that in all these guys, right? Like Musk put all of his own money into Tesla and SpaceX when he founded them. Nikola Tesla basically died bankrupt. Edison went bankrupt a few times. And he kept persisting and kept innovating. It's a constant thread.
Melissa, I'm going to take you off topic just a little bit before we wrap up. I have a personal question. I'm considering getting an MBA, and I'm wondering the benefits about business school.
And what is it that you want to do with it?
Well, I run a business now, and I went to college later in life, so I went back in my late 20s and have been using my management degree to run my business. But I didn't know all the things I didn't know, and I benefited from them greatly. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure there are things I don't know that could benefit me now. Is it worth going to business school, or is it better to continue having the experience, living the experience, and learning that way?
Wow, that's a lightning rod of a question. You said you have a management degree already?
Yes.
An undergraduate degree?
Yes, I went to the School of Management at University of San Francisco.
Okay, and what is it your company does?
Well, I'm an author and I create a lot of online resources.
Okay. And is there something in particular that you feel like you're missing? Like, do you get up in the morning and think, oh man, I wish I knew how to do X, Y, Z?
No, it's mostly that I'm afraid that I could be more equipped if I had a better education, and I don't know what I'm missing.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to say, and it's a little bit controversial, so funny to be saying it on a public podcast. But if, the MBA is a perfect degree for someone who's got a technical background or an arts background, or like they have their undergrad degree in sociology or in English or in engineering, and then they want to learn about business and management skills to go out and, either start their own company or work for a big bank or something like that, right? In your case, if you already have a management undergrad degree, I'm not sure an MBA is going to be where your maximum value add would be. You might find that if you're doing a lot of online stuff that you want to do a specialized thing around data analytics or data visualization, or maybe around market research, or maybe you may not even need a degree at all. Also an MBA, a lot of an MBA is around networking and recruiting. And I have to say that when we bring in our incoming classes of MBAs, I personally find it a little bit discouraging that they are involved in the recruiting process the first semester they get there. So a lot of the MBA program for those people is about getting a job in a big corporation and networking and meeting the people they need to do that. The people who come to our part-time MBA program at night who already have jobs are often people who don't have a management background. They have a more specialized background or a technical background, and they want some management skills. You don't fall into either of those two categories. So an MBA is probably not the right thing for you to do.
Melissa, you may get an email offering a different perspective from Tony's father after he hears this episode of the podcast.
Oh, I may get 50 emails from my colleagues who say, how dare you say that?
Well, actually, the co-founder of my company, I co-founded a company about a year ago with my co-founder's name is Joanna, and she has an MBA. And she was part of that process that you're talking about, where even while she was in business school, she was basically contracted to Bain, where she would work with them for 2 years after she graduated. So it definitely fit into that category. And I've asked her the same question on Tony's behalf, and she shared a very similar answer that you gave, Melissa.
Well, I really appreciate it, because I'm on the fence and I'm looking to the experts to guide me. And I very much appreciate your honest answer.
Oh, good. I'm very honest. Sometimes more honest than people want me to be.
All right, Melissa. So this is a podcast that normally focuses on companies that are actively trying to make the world a better place in some way, whether environmentally or public health or animal welfare or something. So let me just ask you, are there any companies that you would like to see get started that could solve any pressing social problems that you're particularly concerned about?
Companies that I want to see get started.
Yeah. Any ideas for would-be entrepreneurs who may be listening to you, who are looking for some way to help change the world, and they're looking for your expertise as to what's some problem that you think that they might be able to solve through a new company?
Well, I'm actually, and I'm not saying this just because of your background, but I'm actually so incredibly excited about the movement now for all sorts of vegan alternatives to animal products. I mean, I'm actually floored. You had mentioned at one point that you were going to ask me what I was grateful for, and I am grateful for that, because for most of my life, it seemed like almost a hopeless cause, that you were never going to win people around to the idea that we could actually have a functioning economy and happy lives without animal products. And suddenly it seems like the tide is turning. So I'm seeing companies obviously milk is doing really well, right? Like non-animal milk is doing incredibly well. Dairy is collapsing and non-dairy milks are doing terrific. They haven't mastered cheese yet. So, I'd like to see that mastered. But Just Eggs we had for the first time the other day, and we eat Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers all the time. And I think that could be really totally path changing for the economy in so many wonderful ways. So, I'm thrilled that movement is underway. I'm not sure how much room. I think I'm sure it's difficult. It's difficult for any entrepreneur. Any startup is going to struggle, and most startups are going to fail. But I do think that the writing is on the wall that meat-based products, they're on a death spiral now. It's a slow one. It'll take a while, but I wouldn't be investing in that. But you should invest in like Cargill, because they're investing in non-animal meats.
Let's say you just mentioned that most startups are going to fail. Are there any resources that you would recommend that would help them not fail?
Here's what you have to kind of understand. Every successful entrepreneur I've met has been a serial entrepreneur. And they've had a little venture that failed, and another little venture that had a little bit of success and then failed. And then they had another venture that was maybe more successful, and then they sold that. And then they got another venture that failed spectacularly. And then they finally had a venture that was a big success, and then you heard about them. So it's almost never somebody's first venture that's successful, because it's not just a learning process, but it's a bootstrapping and building connections process. And when somebody, if you're trying to attract an investor, for example, they're not going to look at your product and say, great product, or, maybe look at your slides and say, great slides. They're going to look at your track record, and they're going to say, okay, you're getting better. You've learned. Here's what you're good at. Here's what you're not good at. So there are things you got to know. There are things, there's lots of ways to fail as an entrepreneur. And so there are things you have to know to try to avoid those. But even if you know everything and do everything right, most entrepreneurial ventures are still going to fail. And you just have to keep at it, and you have to start up something else again, start up another firm.
Well, wise words from a Sage Business School professor and author of a great book, and hopefully another great book, I'm sure. Although I know you just published a new technical book, right?
Yeah, so I have a textbook on strategic management, technological innovation, and it's in its 6th edition now. It's widely available, 6 languages, but it's pretty heavy reading. It's used in college courses.
All right. Well, very cool. Melissa Schilling, we're really grateful to you for spending your time with us. And we appreciate your book, and we'll certainly be encouraging folks to read it.
Yes, and
Great.
We'll be linking all of that in our show notes.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
Bye.
All right, folks, thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business, or really just in making the world a better place, about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.